I'm excited to welcome you to our final panel discussion of the day, the future of the research university and the role of technology policy, pedagogy as leadership. My name is Megan Finnigan, and I'm a graduate student in the MIT Technology and Policy program, class of 2026. My research is carried out in MIT's Humanitarian Supply Chain Lab, where I study innovative solutions for rebuilding housing after natural disasters. This session explores the role of technology policy in the evolution of technically focused research universities in the context of a rapidly changing higher education landscape, in particular offering interdisciplinary translational perspectives at the nexus of engineering systems, civic engagement, and public service. We are joined today by a distinguished panel of scholars and educators whose work spans civic design, history of science and technology, political science, and systems engineering. Ellan Spero will serve as our moderator. She is an instructor in TPP, IDSS, and the Department of Material Science and Engineering. Dr. Spero is a historian of technology and business whose research examines narratives of progress, academic industrial ecosystems, materials innovation policy, and socio-technical material systems. She's also co-founder of Station One, a nonprofit higher education institution focused on a new model of directional science and technology grounded in social and environmental responsibility, intentionality, and shared purpose. Munther Dahleh is the William A. Coolidge Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and founding director of the Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT. His research addresses systemic risk, networked systems, and the economics of data. Professor Dahleh has pioneered foundational theory in robust control, information propagation, and decision-making in complex systems. Ken Oy is Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT, and Director of the Program on Emerging Technologies. His work spans international relations, political economy, and adaptive regulation of emerging technologies. Professor Oy has published extensively on synthetic biology, pharmaceuticals, and risk governance, and has advised organizations including the UN, WHO, NIH, and PCAST. Ceasar McDowell is a professor of the practice of civic design in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. Professor McDowell is an expert on civic design, community engagement, and the use of social technology to enhance both. His current work is on the design of civic infrastructures and processes to connect the increasingly demographically complex public. He co-hosts the We Who Engage podcast series on civic design. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. It's now my pleasure to turn the conversation over to our moderator, Dr. Ellan Spero, who will guide us through today's session.
Thank you so much, Megan. And it's really a pleasure to be the last panel, because in so many ways we kind of get to synthesize and think about all of the different things that have been happening today in this super packed and intellectually rich day. So I'll invite each of our distinguished colleagues to say a few opening words, and then we'll have some discussion and think about synergies in this excellent topic of the research university and technology policy. So we'll go in this order, starting with Munther.
Okay, thank you, Ellan. And I just wanted to congratulate TPP for the 50th anniversary and thank Christine Ortiz and her team for putting this amazing event together. I really enjoyed it, and I'm very proud of seeing where things are. So just to take you back a little bit in history, 2013, when we were forming the Institute for Data Systems and Society, we had a vision of what that institute is. And the idea is that to address in a systematic way societal problems. And to us, that meant an interaction of three different components. One component had to do with the systems or the engineering aspect or the biological systems and the physics and chemistry and protocols and so forth. Another component was the social behavior interacting with these systems, people interacting with these systems. And the third component was institutions, about the policy and regulations of the interaction between these systems. And the institutions is really all about the TPP program. we envisioned at that time that the only way we can address this complex societal problem is by having data. We always had data in the middle of this triangle that's connecting the data from the systems, the data from people, and the data from institutions in the right way. Now, these data sets are never the same. They're not on the same time scale, they're not the same resolution, but they're quite heterogeneous. But nevertheless, it's the data that is going to enable us to answer a lot of the questions that we encounter today in terms of what's good for the society. So I contend right now that given the democratization of algorithms and a lot of what you're seeing in terms of generative AI and machine learning and so forth, is that the most important thing that we're encountering today is the data. It's the data that is responsible for new discovery. It's the data that is probably responsible for biased decisions. It is the data that is responsible for accountability, because it's the right data that you need to retrieve to assign accountability for failure. Today, with digital platforms, whether it's actually social network platforms or e-commerce platform, data is being manipulated, either manipulated against your privacy or manipulated in these antitrust problems that we're seeing with price fixing and driving people out of business. So the data is the core of everything that we do, and today we still don't have the right framework for understanding data. You know, addressing the question of data as a property right has failed, you know, entirely. And this is the example of the GDPR program in Europe, where essentially it's sort of an empowerment, and it's about empowerment of people that own the data, but really no one knows who owns the data. And to think about it in terms of data as a resource, which really is a more of an alternative way, and following Senator Mackey's comments of thinking about effect, you know, is probably another way to look into all of this. And I see that this is the emerging aspect of what's happening in technology and policy today. I have this anecdote because when we started and we took in technology and policy into IDSS, because we thought this is the only way we can actually address societal problems, is to have this program part of us. There was an interesting debate whether this program should be renamed Technology Policy or Technology and Policy. And we actually had a pretty interesting debate about something that seemed esoteric at the time, but we decided to keep it as Technology and Policy. So this is not just a program about technology policy, it's about public policy. And what we're seeing today, for example, with artificial intelligence, is that it's impacting every domain out there. It has become a question of public policy, not just about technology and policy, technology and public policy. And I think that what we're seeing, the shift today, but the preparation in this particular program is enabling us to think about the, you know, in every domain, how do we think about this particular technology changing how the domain is operating and how people are interacting with it. So I think it's an exciting time for the program, and I'm very pleased to be a speaker today with you.
Thank you. Ken.
You want me to go?
Ken.
Okay, yeah, happy to go. So let me begin with an anecdote. When I first arrived on campus, I was housemaster at East Campus, and for those of you that know MIT, you understand that that is a challenging position. President Vest, Chuck Vest, came over to deliver remarks and socialize with the students, which was terrific. Much to my shock and surprise, he was very serious in his discussion of gaps in MIT's education, speaking to the topic of pedagogy. He said, we do a great job of teaching our students and having our research create new technologies. We do a bad job of teaching how to engage with the implications of the technologies, and it's something that we need to fill. And then he talked a little bit about policy and how we needed to up our game. Now, I'm mentioning that because about a couple years later, Richard de Neufville, sitting in the front row, recently honored, and I were talking, and we were talking about how to fill that gap even beyond the existing TPP program. And NSF had a program, Integrated Graduate Research and Training, that we thought provided an opportunity to do something that would be building on existing strengths, but a bit different. And Richard handed off to Dan Hastings and Dahleh. And so what happened was that we did a proposal on emerging technologies, but to assess implications and to engage with the implications. So you get a bunch of students, it was STS and poli-sci and history. And we got people together, and the first thing that we decided was we didn't know what we were talking about. We didn't know what we were talking about, and we thought it was useful to be looking back at past examples of efforts to engage with implications of emerging technologies as they were coming in. And what we found was that the assessments as technologies were coming in were way off, not a little, abysmal. And then here's where MIT arrogance gave way to humility. We decided that we actually wouldn't be able to do much better on projections. And we developed an emphasis on uncertainty, adaptation, and learning as hallmarks of the program that we were doing, and then set up research and training built on those principles. So the research very quickly went on from looking at the old cases, but looking ahead to internet-related stuff on the one hand and synthetic biology on the other. You can't do everything. And Dave Clark, who just spoke, was anchoring the IT part, and a guy named Drew Endy was actually our anchor on the SynBio side. But looking to these technologies and working actively with the technologists on an appraisal of what was happening, but also on setting up adaptive approaches to engaging with benefits and risks and improving the terms of the trade-offs across them, thinking about Senator Markey's remarks on AI. On pedagogy. So we designed a purpose-built course. NSF insisted on it. And so, we all fill out the forms and do the proposal, but it turned out to be real, much to our shock and surprise. It turned out to be real in a couple senses. Dan Hastings, as head of TPP, was saying, that course that we've just planned, it fits pretty well with the needs of the TPP program. And he looked at me and said, now, what are you going to focus on? And I said, classic, old-fashioned market failure and political and institutional failure, as I would have taught it and did teach at the Wilson School and Kennedy School. But for MIT and this program, we have to emphasize knowledge, how knowledge is created, how knowledge is assessed and evaluated, and the games that are played as that takes place, with MIT being an active generator, but also an interpreter of the information. So Dan Hastings, many of you have known that Dan is one of the most convincing people in the world. And he said, so you don't mind if we make it required? And I said, I plan to actually require papers and other stuff. I don't want to have students in there that don't want to be there. And Dan said, you're being selfish. And I said, yes. And then he looked me in the eye and he said, can you honestly say that the course that we've just designed is not something that all TPP students could benefit from? So it became mandatory. Its size increased over time. And it still has morphed through several changes and exists. But a final note on adaptation and uncertainties. Part of the feedback to pedagogy here was talking to students who returned, getting a sense of what was useful or not when people went on to the many interesting things that they do. And to my shock and surprise, the classic standard economics of market failure and politics of institutional failure work was helpful, but not as useful as the fights over knowledge. Just today, a TPP alum with years of experience in Washington said, I liked that class, but the part that I didn't like when I was taking it is what I think about every day and use every day. In Trump's Washington, fights over knowledge, climate change, COVID origins, fights over knowledge, advisory committees being shut down. And I just want to say a thank you. And the thank you actually is that engaging with TPP, IDSS, has actually been, frankly, a high watermark. It's been a high point for the years that I've been teaching and doing research at MIT. And it's a thank you to a whole bunch of students who are sitting there and feeding back and engaging over many years. But thank you again.
Thank you.
I want to kind of approach this in a little different approach, but actually building off of the kind of pedagogical issue. And I actually want to take you back to the Kalahari Desert in Africa. A good friend of mine used to do a lot of research there. He's a psychologist. And he would always tell me this story about a friend of his named Thomaso, who was an elder who lived in that community, a kind of a spiritual leader. And my friend Dick had kind of spent about 5 years there doing recording of what was going on in the language and how they talked about things. And I just want to give you, none of you will know, well, some of you will know this, but Dick had to carry around what was called one of the field Nagra recorders. So it was a box about this big, right, reel to reel, that's what he was working with. And as they knew more and more and more over time coming together, one day Thomaso asked him how that thing worked. And Dick tried to explain it to him, how, you speak in one end and, then it ends up on this tape and, he didn't really know. Dick didn't know. And Thomaso asked him again, how does it work? And Dick tried to explain again and couldn't really explain the mechanics of it, the science behind it. And then Thomaso said to him, well, where did you get it from? And he said, I bought it in a store. And he says, what did the person in the store tell you? He said, well, no, I went there, I paid for it, I got it, I went to use it. And Thomaso said, in our culture, we would never give someone something so powerful with us knowing how it works. It means where does it come from? And what he was really saying there is not so much just about the technology, but about how do we he was answering the question, how is it possible that we create this kind of thing in our world? What is our understanding of the world? What is the understanding of our culture and who we are, that this could be something that is created out of it? And I think this is a really critical point for where we are in our society right now, because this question of how we understand who people are going to be engaged with, of who this public is critically important. So as Thomaso was talking about one culture, right, among the people of the Kalahari Desert, right now, anyone who's sitting in this classroom, any student who's in the classroom, any community that's working together is dealing a critical issue, which is we're sitting among the most demographically complex set of people, and we have neither an infrastructure or process that actually allows them to do meaning making together. And so then, if you're sitting in a policy position at a current point, how do you do that? How do you know if you know that people have actually been able to meet that? And this is one of our real challenges going forward. And so our work right now that we've been working on is this question of how do you start to design frameworks that actually help people grapple with that. We don't have the answers, but we have places where people can test it. And so my question, and I should say my concern is, as we start to prepare people in their fields, but their fields have to engage the public, then there's a new threshold that we're facing. And that is that the threshold is that every place we test the public and meet up against them, we're actually challenged with the thing of how are we supporting democracy in the way that we're engaging with people, right? Not that it's something sitting over there somewhere and I can do my work with some people and do it. And we don't have structures to do it. It was wonderful listening to Marky today about what they can do in the processes of how they got together laws. But I know that process, and I know how it's not engaged, how it's not inclusive. Yes, you get things out of it, but in the end, it's a structure that's designed in a way that is not going to let most of us who need to be included and part of what we do and build. And so we need to think about how do we open up that process in our pedagogical process, in our learning, so that students and people and researchers can engage with that issue more.
Thank you. And maybe I'll start off with pulling on some of those themes about what we teach, especially being grounded in a technologically focused research university. We've had a lot of discussion about interdisciplinarity throughout the whole day, and of course data has been at the heart of everything. How do we bring core pieces of technology policy, ways of thinking that are inherently interdisciplinary to prepare future leaders in science and technology? What are the pieces that rise to the top for you to carry forward into the future? You want to start? Go for it.
Okay, I'll go for it. Senator Markey issued a challenge today in his remarks. Okay, he spoke of his legislation on AI and civil rights, and in his remarks he mentioned a problem. And the problem was that the data sets used for training have baked into them past patterns of discrimination. The effects of past discrimination are present. And if you then you do your machine learning on that data to generate predictions and decision rules on credit and default, or on educational performance and admissions, or employment and hiring, or recidivism and sentencing, you're going to be coming up with decision rules that will be biased against protected categories, but they may actually be accurate in their predictions, just to be bad, because the predictions bake into them the bad stuff that is part of life. So my question that I want to pose to my panelists, using this as an example, how do we address this problem? We also have law coming in, and with Nick Ashford sitting there in the second row, we're all aware of it. But if you look at how the federal courts have handled discrimination cases, over the years they've tended to emphasize more and more and more, not just the demonstration that a practice has a discriminatory effect, but require demonstrations of intention in order to rule. Well, what does it mean to be talking about demonstration of effect? That's pretty clear. But what does it mean to be demonstrating intent in the context of machine learning? I'm just laying that out because then we can talk about how to research it, but also how to do education on it and some thoughts on that. But just wanted to lay out that as an extension of Senator Markey's comments.
Well, I'm not going to answer your question directly, but I do want to say that in IDSS and TPP, we sort of think of this notion of a trilingual student, not bilingual, but trilingual. And the one piece of it is the data and information part, which is really critical to understand. Another piece of it is the social reasoning. And then the third component is the domain. And with these three, you can sort of rationalize about a lot of these problems. The challenge that the senator has put forth, of course, aspects of it, we know how to answer, and aspects we don't know how to answer. And I think this is research up and coming. But what is interesting, I'm going to give you an example. A lot of times, actually, what's going on with AI systems as a demonstration of why we need the trilingual student to engage the policy. What's going on in that system is actually not the bias in the data and not a problem of the algorithm, but the interaction between the two. And I can give you a lot of examples where algorithm is agnostic, data set is good, and you start generating bad data because of the application of the algorithm. And this is something that is very hard to understand for someone who is not deep into the domain and into the data science and AI. And this is becoming a problem. A policymaker in the past might have been able to get consultation from somebody on a problem they wanted to regulate. Now, who do you get the consultation from? Not from companies, because they're not interested in giving you that answer. And there, of course, from their perspective, there's a monetary aspect to this. And another perspective is the tension between regulation and innovation, which they don't know how to solve, and somehow the government doesn't know how to solve. You take away data, we take away from innovation, and somehow we need to figure out that sort of sweet spot. So there is that tension that is ongoing. And what we believe and what we're trying to produce in the TPP program and the IDSS program for the PhD is this idea of the one person who's able to navigate the three dimensions of the problem. Now, what is the specifics of that? I mean, there's some answers and some open questions. I'm going to leave that to Ceasar, maybe that's it.
Oh, I'm supposed to solve that one? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can do that one, but I do think that, we, as I said before, this kind of complexity that we set out sometimes feels overwhelming, but I also think that it's not that hard if we actually engage it as locally as possible. As human beings, if we experience things over time that are differently, we can start to adapt them, right? So you can think about we do this a lot in some of our classes in DUS, where we have this whole process where students actually have to go through their own building a kind of contract with themselves in relationship to their behavior in the society they live in, right? Not just how am I gonna live in my home, but just everything that I do and how do I think about that? Because when I step out into the world as a planner, it's gonna have lots of implications that I don't know, that I have to engage with, I have to make some tough decisions around, and I'm going to have to make some trade-offs. And we are not very good at actually having those kinds of conversations and setting up those contexts. Just give you a little example. I don't know, we do this in one of our big classes sometimes. We actually ask everyone in the class after about halfway of the semester, we've been sitting with people for the whole semester, and we say to them, we'd like each of you to stand up and just think for a minute, take a reflection, and then we'd like you to tell us, what's the one thing that you feel uncomfortable talking with other people in this room about? And people go around and actually give it. And then we tell them, before you come into class, next class, you have to find 2 other people and have that conversation with them that's in the classroom. And it shifts the dynamic in the room because now people are knowing each other a little bit different. So I think sometimes we extract these problems and saying they're out there, as opposed to say we have to build the dynamic and the complexity in the community that we're in. We have a little bit of as I was talking to Ellan about this the other day, is that and that's not only in terms of what we do in the classroom, but it's actually how we think about how are we replicating systems that aren't what we want to do inside of how we even build the institution we're in, and how we question them, and how do we actually challenge them. So I think sometimes it's looking very much personally what's in front of you in the place that we actually live together to start to challenge and open up some of those spaces. So.
Thinking about that really excellent suggestion and how to use it in many different settings. So I've sat on the Novel and Exceptional Technologies Research Advisory Committee of NIH until it was killed by the Trump administration. And I also was assigned to a task force, a subgroup, on stakeholder engagement in medical research and clinical research. And part of that is community engagement. You go out, people from patients groups, people from local communities of all sorts talk. But I was thinking about your advice because those conversations were very stilted. And in fact, people were not talking about what bothered them the most in some cases. So I think I was trying to channel you a little bit, but at one point, part of a small group, and this could apply to MIT as well, but I said, you're not saying something right now that's bugging you. What is it now? In any setting, there is always something that people aren't saying, so that's a very safe question to ask. And this person who hadn't been talking much said, well, I actually am worried because I don't know enough about research and research design to address the questions that NIH is asking us to address. How am I supposed to be sitting there as a patient to weigh in on my interests and how that should be reflected in research? I need to know more about research design. So at that point, the academics were sitting there and we're actually thinking seriously about how you teach on research design, what the trade-offs are if you change it in various ways, and could you do that in a way that would actually work with people without a heck of a lot of advanced training. And we actually talked about it a lot and came to the conclusion that it could kind of be done with examples, okay, and with some formal stuff. And someone said, oh, you're really going to go into Bayesian decision analytics? And the answer was, maybe, maybe not. But very serious point. People are capable of operating at a pretty high level if they're not afraid to talk. And most of the time, people are kind of afraid to talk. But within MIT, that's also true. It's not just people sitting in Bangor, Maine at an NIH community meeting.
No, it's a fantastic example. And I think we have community and multiple communities, multiple publics kind of at the heart of what makes so much of this work important and then really difficult at the same time. So thinking about kind of where we sit at the institutional level, what are some of the opportunities for a program like TPP, for a center like IDSS to bridge multiple groups, to amplify some of the impacts across our ecosystem? I mean, we're also sitting in the heart of such a major innovation ecosystem, and MIT plays a giant role in that. So I would love your thoughts on kind of thinking about where we as an institute can focus some of our efforts to really amplify that impact across our ecosystem.
So I take a crack at this and start slightly differently. You know, when we talk about pedagogy and leadership and decision making, I think we live in a new world, even for us who grew into it. You know, the way I think about it, and I have a lot of problems with this. You know, that you're supposed to know everything, right? If the toilet breaks, you're supposed to fix it because there's a YouTube video somewhere that can tell you how to fix it. Your coffee machine, you know, again, you have to fix it. You go to the doctor, you have to know what's wrong with you. You have to figure it out yourself, you know, because you may be prescribed a medicine, but you don't like it, and you go do the research and you go counter. We have to sort of do everything because now the information is available out there. And this idea that you're a specialist in everything is impossible. And so, but somehow, again, the cost of the plumber is so prohibitive that, yeah, you know, you should be able to do it, but, you know, that's against my sanity. What is the cost of that? I can't put that into numbers. So things have changed, right? And this availability of information, and we'll talk about what is pedagogical to the leaders. I go to my class right now, by the way, I teach reinforcement learning in AI, and last year I had 50 students in the class, and this year I have 350 students in the class. Wow. And why? Because, well, now LLMs need reinforcement learning, and all the students want to know what that is, and I got this influx. And I walked into class. I have a lot of kids now from age 18 to 25, right? And then the tail distribution. First thing I told them is that I don't know how to teach you. You know, I actually don't know how to teach this kind of generation. I really need to work very hard on it. And these days I flip my classes. I don't lecture in class because this idea of standing there for an hour and 20 minutes, talking to a bunch of kids, I mean, just insane. You know, and a lot of them stop coming to class, right? So we flip the classes and we try to figure out what do they need to know and how do they engage and how do they talk about the problems. But I do think that there is a difference. The kids of today, the generation, and the answer to your question is that most of what we can do is about education. Yes, okay, we can be a platform for connections and stakeholders and bringing everybody around. We could do all of that stuff. But the most critical thing we do at MIT is education and educating the students that we have. And I'm saying we have a challenge, but we have an opportunity because these kids, they're driven by missions, they're driven by problems. And I think that we need to sort of create the situation in the classroom where these students are challenged, are thinking how to bring all these different challenges together. So I think that's where we want to focus. And I would advocate to my colleagues right now that we need to have those conversations on campus to figure out how do we do this right.
So, Munther, following really on those remarks, and I was kind of thinking about this because I'm not teaching that class right now, okay? But surfing off of what we've heard today, if I was doing that science, technology, and public policy class, either appending to that or as a second semester, what about something stolen from Princeton University? Princeton's a little different from MIT. The Wilson School is a little different from IDSS. Sorry, the formerly called Woodrow Wilson School, School of Public Policy. But they had something called policy task forces and policy conferences. And it wasn't to displace the standard courses, it was on top of them. So you get a bunch of people together, but they're asked to address a question. And it would be a question of the sort that Senator Markey raised, to go back to that example. But it might be on other stuff. It could be on data access and availability, on healthcare, many, many areas. And you get a bunch of different people in the room, like a commission, trying to use their resources. They have a budget, Princeton's rich, to invite people in. But to be gathering information, to figuring out how to structure the problem, what are the areas of uncertainty, what don't you know at the end? If you could commission research, what would you commission the research on? And that might be a good way for TPP to perhaps take a next step, for IDSS to take a next step. And it could be done as pedagogy, or it could be done, frankly, as institute-wide task forces, which we have done in the past. But just thinking a little bit, it's a real issue. And maybe addressing real problems that we've been challenged to address would be a very, very good way of lending service, but also doing pedagogy.
And I think the only thing I want to add to that is the students who are growing up now, are moving forward now, and because of how they're learning, also have a tendency to have a lot more insulated in their world and how they're doing and their connections to each other. And if we don't try to disrupt that, the kinds of, the consequences we're getting of people then building policies and technologies where they don't know even how to interconnect and engage with and deliberate with other people isn't going to happen. So I think there's something very critical that we have to figure out how to approach as this is a problem, it's a societal problem. We have to figure out how to disrupt it in our educational program in order for people to do what they really are doing.
Yeah, and I think this combination of coming back to our theme of North Stars and new routes, where do we find continuity? And then where do we find charting something entirely new, that disruption, continuity and kind of transformation at the same time without thinking that they're opposites, but that they can kind of amplify each other in different ways and hopefully towards a more collective public good. And I see that we only have 20 seconds left. So as much as I would love to start a new topic, I think perhaps we should just thank this distinguished panel and invite more discussion and new ideas of ways forward, reflecting on TPP and the future, building on the past over our reception. And I know we have one final piece of the program, so hold those thoughts, stay with us, and thank you so much.
Thank you.